Well, welcome to the session on improving design processes. I think we have got a very weird and wonderful mix of papers in this sessions, and I think it's a reminder that we can improve design processes in many different ways. And one of the themes that's really running across all of the papers is just the multitude of people and experiences and expertise that need to come together in an effective way to make design processes work well. And I think the different talks are shedding an interesting light on this from a multitude of perspectives. The first talk is going to talk about collaboration across different expertise. And the second one is going to talk about collaboration and people with different genders coming together and the roles that they can adopt. And in the third talk, we'll have got different people in the business experience positioning their work in the context in which they're operating. And then we are learning a little bit about how we can try to assess how well the processes work. And I think the last talk is addressing the questions, what is the process anyway, and how can we describe it, and how can different people come together around a shared understanding of design processes. So I'm very much looking forward to the session. I suggest we'll get going on the talks now, and then hopefully we have a lively discussion. So to all of you in the audience, the session is only as good as you. So please ask questions as you come along. I suggest you type in your questions to the particular talks as the talks happen, and then I'll try to summarize the talks and the questions and post them to the presenters. So I suggest, Dario, we'll get going at this point. So if you could get the pre-recorded talk starting.
Hello everybody, and welcome to my presentation on choosing the right measures to improve collaboration between design and simulation departments. My name is Sebastian Schweigert-Recksiek and I'm from the Technical University of Munich. Even though this is a short presentation, I will give you an overview of what's about to come. First, we're going to talk about the research questions and research design, then about the bridges approach itself, which is short for barrier reduction in engineering design and simulation. Then we come to the connection of typical barriers in the collaboration between design and simulation departments and recommendations to overcome them, and an application in a case study. First, to the research questions. The success factor of my research is the efficiency of collaboration between design and simulation departments. And I know that there are barriers in industry that prevent this efficiency from being high. We try to find recommendations how to overcome these barriers and support that with structural network metrics that are used to analyze system graphs of the collaboration. As it is hard to measure the efficiency of collaboration in general, what we are using as a measurable success factor is the degree of perceived efficiency of collaboration. There are three research questions guiding this research. One of them is, what are typical barriers in the collaboration of design and simulation departments? What are appropriate measures to enhance the collaboration, and how do you match these two items, the barriers and the recommendations? This is the topic of the bridges approach. As I said before, bridges is short for barrier reduction in design, engineering, and simulation, and the approach consists of 4 phases: a situation description, a characterization, finding measures, and then implementing them. On the top, you always have the inputs for each of these phases. So first, for the situation description, we gather data, for example, from email exchange or from calendar data, or also from file repositories and task boards, or from checklists and workshops. By that, we build up system graphs that can be semi-automatically analyzed in the second phase of the characterization. By that, we can identify critical areas of the collaboration. And these critical areas are then matched with barriers of the collaboration as found in empirical research. Therefore, we then propose some measures to overcome these barriers and implement these measures in workshops. So what we are trying to find are improvement opportunities. There always has to be an identified barrier and a suitable recommendation to make up an improvement opportunity. Out of the empirical research that I'm going to present later on, there are 20 typical barriers in the collaboration, as well as 16 improvement measures. So we have 320 possible connections. And now the goal is to find the right connection of a barrier and the recommendation for each company in each specific situation. So how is this done? To find these connections between recommendations and barriers, I did some empirical research. First, there was an online survey with 73 participants, and this data was statistically analyzed to find links between recommendations and degree of perceived efficiency on the one hand, and between recommendations and barriers on the other hand. This was then supported with expert interviews from 16 different companies. So for example, we know that the conflict of objectives between design, simulation, and test can have a negative influence on the degree of perceived efficiency. But we also know from the empirical data that the higher the effort of quality of information transmission in initial phases, the lower the barrier and the higher the degree of perceived efficiency of collaboration. So these pairs is what we are looking for in the data. So now that the data was analyzed and we have these pairings of barriers and recommendations, we can go into the case study. The case study was performed together with an industry partner from a heating system solution company. There was the most pressing barrier identified as inefficient front-loading and dependency of simulation on design and test departments. And we chose the recommendation of scheduling and identification of priorities and needs as the most suitable one. To implement this recommendation, the RACI method was selected. This was then applied to new processes that the industry partner was setting up in a research project on conception and implementation of a digital twin. And there are also 2 other papers at this conference that deal with this project. Within these new target processes, we introduced these RACI decision points where there was always somebody responsible and accountable to be consulted and to be informed at every crucial step in the process. So as a summary, the approach offers a way to overcome barriers in the collaboration of design and simulation departments. And now there will be an evaluation study coming up. And then I'm going to write my thesis and hope to hand it in by the end of the year. Thank you.
I have the pleasure to present you a European study of stereotypes and the perception of gender equality in global corporations. My name is Professor Julie Stal-Le Cardinal. I'm working at Centrale Lab. I have the pleasure to work with the Women Initiative Foundation, and our mission is to become a key player in promoting the advancements of women in the workplace and in the economy. As Martin Liotto says, if women win, we all win. This study, in partnership with ENGIE, BNP Paribas, and Centrale Supélec Industrial Engineering Research Department, was carried out in 4 global companies and across 3 European countries, France, Germany, and Italy. We've also had access to similar data collected by the Cleman Institutes in California. The questionnaire was published online in summer 2017, and I'm going to present you the main results. The main question underlying our research is to identify the obstacles to women's professional development and consequently to know how to improve gender parity at all levels. The questionnaire response rates was significant for both men and women. Over 2,400 people responded in France, Germany. The results concern stereotypes men and women have on men and women, and the perceptions of gender parity and discrimination in large corporations. Concerning stereotypes, it turns out that men and women have stereotypes that are similar in the 3 countries. Stereotypes are identical for men regardless of hierarchical status, but they vary for women. Women senior executives are seen as behaving more like men. The reasons for women behaving like men are essentially self-censorship, jokes about women, the fact that less women seek power and promoting women due to affirmative action policies. The reasons vary from country to country. For example, self-censorship is less present in Italy. Concerning the perception of gender parity, we address here the following themes: work-life balance, company experience, perceived equality, and causes for the glass ceiling. Work-life balance is not a real gender issue. In the 3 countries, there is little difference between men and women, but 60% of respondents consider their work takes on too much importance. Company experience was studied from 4 angles: pride in belonging, women in management, the feeling of discrimination, and declining promotions. Pride in belonging and women in management are not gender issues. The feeling of discrimination varies widely depending on gender and country. Declining promotions is more common for men. 16% of women and 23% of men have already turned down a post with greater responsibilities. The perception of a culture of equality varies widely depending on countries, and large gaps between men's and women's perceptions is found in all countries. However, it's also in France that affirmative action for women is perceived the most. Family constraints are identified by both women and men as the #1 reasons for the glass ceiling in all countries. Concerning the opening up to the USA, the main differences concern work-life balance and the lack of an American policy supporting maternity. Only 3 countries in the world, of which 1 is the USA, do not have a maternity support program. We have set out a summary of the main findings and lessons from the study conducted on stereotypes and perceptions of gender parity in large corporations. You've got here some key takeaways, and detailed results can be found on WIF website. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Mattia and today I'm going to present a paper co-written with Boris and Charlie of the title Paradoxical Tension, Balancing Contextual Ambidexterity. A little bit of the background. Ambidextrous organization should benefit by increasing in revenue, profit, and productivity, as well as generate a significant competitive advantage. However, there is a critical gap, which is defined as balance problem of how to manage both type of innovation, radical and incremental, in an effective and efficient way. A framework on how we can close that gap. So we propose at the end model. There are 3 types of ambidexterity: sequential ambidexterity, structural ambidexterity, and contextual ambidexterity. Sequential ambidexterity is doing radical innovation, incremental innovation, radical innovation, incremental innovation. Structural there are 2 separate departments that don't share resources and don't share information, and they do both types of innovation. One department does incremental and another one does radical. So they don't cross-pollinate each other. Instead, the one that is said to be the most effective one is the contextual ambidexterity type of model, where both innovation are done by the same department. So resources are managed in a better way. Resources are more provide better results, and the organization is said to be a leader in their market as they can pick up early on radical innovation. If we look at this from a structural point of view, we focus on micro-foundational theory because, as we know, organizational structure has in 3 main levels: strategy, tactics, and operation. and we focus on individual level, as in each of those, the individual is making a decision. So we propose a leadership type, ambidextrous leader, which has some capability, for example, of switching behavior between different type of innovation, managing resources in an ingenious way, and also, for example, being comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainties, especially in radical innovation, where there are a lot of this. If we look from a strategic point of view and we merge what we said before, the contextual, ambidexterity and innovation and the leader, we see more proposing the 2x2, where there is a performance zone, which is the one that is business as usual for the organization, and an incubation zone where new ideas and radical ideas are developed and researched. However, Moore doesn't say how to select innovation to move from the incubation zone to the transitional zone and from the transitional zone to the performance zone. So, and how to transfer is where our focus goes. And we suggest abductive reasoning as a way to select ideas and the quality capabilities of the ambidextrous leader to transfer that ideas and further develop to make it the core product of the organization in the years to come. So at the end, we present this framework or model for innovation, which base the foundation are what we discussed before. So we focus on contextual ambidexterity, and we suggest to generate a great vision as a radical innovation, and then as we look and research to meet this radical innovation, we have incremental steps, and that is where we need to do both type of innovation in the same department. So then by doing this, the organization at operational tactic level meet the strategy that's been developed by the people at strategic level. So we have a strategy fit. Then we have the strategic execution is where the ambidextrous leader, make the decision on how to move the ideas and how to invest in resources. And then there is the integration of those within the strategy. Thank you so much. And if you have any question, feel free to reach out.
Hi there, my name is Freddie. I'm a researcher from the University of Strathclyde. My research looks at the resource forecasting of product and industrial design projects, looking at the factors that affect those resources, modeling the that designers and engineers have of those factors, and use those models to build tools to improve resource forecasting. Let's start with a simple question. How do design projects start? Well, in the main, they start with the creation of a project brief, which will outline details, specifications, expectations of both the client and other stakeholders, and from it we can normally understand the kinds of design effort demands that a project will have. Now, my paper introduces the collaborative scorecard method. Collaborative is a key point there. It's a 7-step process, and it works with every member of a design agency to produce a custom scorecard that can be used by that agency. And it can be completed in about half a day. A little something like this. If you want the full details, I encourage you to have a wee read of the paper. But the important thing is that it looks at finding the most influential factors as perceived by the design agency and finding measurable elements for each of these factors, and then assigning some kind of point scale to them so that projects can be evaluated on those scales. And the scorecard looks a little like this. And this is a sample. We're just looking at one factor, in this case, product complexity, because design researchers love product complexity. And you can see that the top table has got 5 elements, each with a 4-point scale of measurable, or as it's perceived by the design agency, measurable levels. And you can see at the bottom, there's a table that you can then evaluate and each element against, and then tot up a final score. The purpose of this method is firstly to, of course, identify the factors, but not only that, but it's to look at the characteristics of those factors. Part of the process will identify how the level of influence changes in the course of a project. And so you can understand from that the kinds of influence that it has and when it has the greatest impact. The purpose of the method is also to assess projects. You have a scorecard that allows for detailed, comparable, and quantifiable measures that can be that allows for a greater understanding of the project brief prior to launch. Of course, with the measure of a project, this also allows for project comparison. This can be done in multiple levels. Firstly, you can look at the total score of a project, say a project that has a total score of a 4.334, for example, then a design agency can then compare that project to prior projects that have the same score levels and perhaps draw upon the insight that was gained from completing those projects. Similarly, you can also look at the specific factor, for example, product complexity, and you can see the product complexity score also was, say, a 2.333, and you can look at other projects that also had similar element levels and make comparisons and gain and build upon the insight gained from that as well. So what's next? Well, a couple of things we'd like to see to do with this method in the future. Firstly, we're looking to optimize the design space by identifying the negative influences and the positive influences that factors might have, and either reduce in the case of negative or increase in the case of positive the influence of those factors, and also identifying specific measurable elements that you can target in order to make those changes. One thing we're also looking at is the inclusion of a recommendation engine. In a current case study, this is something that we're doing, and we're looking at the moment just to add different buffers upon the different scores being generated to be added to different phases of a project to allow for extra design iterations or extra research time and so on and so forth. So in conclusion, we have a method that has been tested in industry. It's currently being used in industry. It enables direct comparison between varied projects that might not necessarily be able to be compared directly in the past. It aids for the development of what could be considered a corporate memory of insight from past projects, and it's a resource, of course, to aid planning. Thanks very much.
Hello, my name is Miriam. I'm from KIT EPEC, and I'm very glad to present you our research regarding a method for the identification of requirements for designing reference processes. So starting with the motivation, let's assume there's a process author who is responsible for the designing of a new reference within his company. To start his task, he analyzes with the literature and he identifies many reference processes who could support his process development. And also within his company, there are several reference processes which he could use as basis. But unfortunately, the process users don't accept their current reference processes and do not like to use them. And that makes him struggle a bit because he just doesn't know how he can meet the valid restrictions such as norms or regulations, and also address the needs of the process users so that they can use the process and and accept the process and will apply it correctly. So this is a conflict for the process author, and this is just a problem we want to support. So To sum it up, there are many different reference processes available in literature, and in practice there's just little research concerning the systematic identification of requirements for reference processes. Hence, we identify two research questions. The first one is how can process authors identify requirements for the design of reference processes? And the second research question focuses a bit more how the process author can consider these identified requirements during the design of a new or adapted reference process. So coming to the method is structured in several parts and is based on the Spalten problem-solving process and starts with the situation analysis. That means that the process author should get an overview on the situation, on his task, on the environment of his task, and of course get to know the stakeholders and what is their demand. And the second problem containment is an in-depth analysis of the users of the process, as well as the environment, which considers the regulations, for example, to synthesize the valid and relevant process requirements for the further process development. This part answers the research question 1. Part that will answer the research question 2. The process author starts with the design of a reference process or different types of reference processes based on, for example, suitable meta models. It's important to have some variants, some alternatives, so that he can decide on the most suitable solution for the requirements and match the different types of reference processes with the process requirements. And the last step considers the consequences analysis, means that he should investigate which consequences the application of the reference process would have. And the last part is not considered in this contribution, but process author should take a decision, maybe also with considering decision makers, and afterwards recapitulate and learn to improve the next process development process or procedure. This was just a short overview on the results of our paper, and thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy reading the paper. Thank you very much.
Professor Eckert, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was thinking while people are still working out some questions, maybe I could ask 2 clarifying questions after the talk. And one is to Boris, which is, what does ambidextrous actually mean? And to Miriam, what does reference process mean? So maybe, Boris, you could start.
It's usually ladies first, isn't it? But yes, sure. First of all, obviously, the presentation was by our first author, which was Mattia, but I'm standing in for him today. Ambidextrous basically means, or the ambidexterity means that you are able to handle 2 things at the same time. So classically, it comes from people being able to both use the left and the right hands for writing, or as their dominant hands. But in this context of innovation, it basically pertains to the ability to handle both radical as well as incremental innovation. And obviously, from traditionally, the idea has been to create something new, a new space, organizationally, structurally, but also individually, where people could then become more radical in what they produce as an innovation outcome. And while companies tend to be more incremental in gradually developing their ideas further, which is a more classical approach. The idea is, how can you handle both? And there are very different philosophies of how that can be achieved. And Mattia touched upon 3 of them, which are the archetypes of them in his paper. We're basically saying, to sum it up in like a really on one spot, as a bit of an elevator pitch, what we're saying is actually the same people who do incremental innovation can become radical innovators if they produce a vision and then align their incremental innovation to chase that in a long-term perspective. And then you can become radically innovative through gradually stacking the right incremental innovations. That has a big advantage. That is, you're not chasing that end bit right from the start, but you have different steps to go there, and you can pivot as you go along and chase another vision as the market, it's basically because it's volatile and it develops. Long answer to your short question, sorry.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful to have your take on that. Miriam, do you want to talk about reference processes?
Yes, I knew that question would come from you, Claudia. I know that in literature there are many perspectives on reference processes available, and everyone does have his or her own opinion on that topic. We used a previous definition on reference processes from KIT-EPEC, and that implicates that a reference process is a company-specific generic process that describes the usual sequences and process elements, such as, for example, milestones and activities, methods, and so on, for developing a product generation and functions as something like a master process for different development projects. So it's it's on one side company specific. On the other side, it does have a defined scope, which includes multiple projects and not only one project. So it's between a generic meta model, which is provided in the VDE 2122, I think, or other vice versa. Sorry for that. And is not as specific as a project plan, which is used by a project manager to run his project.
Okay, so it's basically the company's generic process model.
Yes.
In old language.
That's
Since reference something or other seems to be the current fashionable term. Thank you very much for clarifying this. I suggest we now go through the presentations in turn with specific questions, and then we can mop up any more questions that come out in the end. But maybe, Sebastian, you can tell us whether you have been able to validate this with companies in the meantime, before we get to the questions addressed to you. We can't hear you, Sebastian. Any luck with your mic? No, we still can't hear you.
No, Sebastian, you're not muted. I can see your microphone is turned on. Maybe you can go check your help desk.
I think in that case, I suggest, Sebastian, you try to sort your mic out, and we move on to Julie's talk, because we had a number of questions on Julie's talk. So we had a couple of questions to you, Julie, from various audience members, and I think the topic of gender in design is something we could discuss endlessly. The first question to you was whether, if gender is no longer the category in which we think, what is the next thing that we need to worry about in terms of inclusion?
In fact, I think it will be still a question, but for me, there's a lot of kind of diversity. In France, for instance, we can speak about sex, whereas in the US, you can't speak about race. So it's culture depending, and for me, it will there will always be a question of sex diversity, but when we have presented this research to different companies and in different countries, people wanted us to work on all diversities aspects. But here the thing is, I am not a feminist, okay? And I am glad to work in the man environment. And for me, it's very important to say that. The thing is how to improve global processes in companies, design processes, decision-making processes, and so forth, by trying to find the good place for everyone. And there's another question about equality and gender equality. For me, it's not a question of equality, but much more a question of equity, because people don't have same needs. And as a woman, I don't have the same needs as another professor who can be a man, for instance. So my needs are different. And the study here was just to try to have an overview of yes, gender in companies, and especially in product design companies.
Thank you, Julie. I think that gets us very neatly to Sebastian's question, which is how would design processes be improved if we had greater gender equality? Julie, have you got any thoughts?
Yes, for me, definitely. If we improve the place of everyone in company design and in company processes, and especially in design processes, I think we will improve design process also. When you can see in my presentation, on the beginning of my presentation, when I presented the Ishikawa diagram of for the reasons why women increases like men, for instance, there's a big issue about self-censorship. And if you look at the situation, the actual situation, just looking at product designers are especially men, and you don't have a lot of women concerning product design. And I'm sure there's a lot of self-censorship. Right now in my School of Engineering in Paris, we have less than 20% of women as engineering students. I'm sure it's not an exception. And for me, it's very hard to understand that. And once again, I'm not a specialist at all about gender issues, but I'm working in design. I'm a girl and I'm a professor in engineering school. And yes, even as a professor, I'm very often the only woman. And for me, working on that, trying to understand why we don't have so many women in design processes, globally speaking, for me, it's very tricky.
Thank you, Julie. Miriam, would you like to answer the question, since you're a woman in an engineering company, what your experiences of the perception of gender roles?
I enjoy being a woman in a man domain, to say it that way, because it's easier to discuss, because men are more rational than most women. So I like it more to team up with men than with women. So it's maybe that I'm also more rational than the other way, and I do not have problems with respect or something like that. Maybe it's because of my personality that I'm a bit more accepted, but I know that some of my female colleagues struggle with some of these topics, because they have the feeling that men do not accept them because they are women. And if they have to think that way, that means that we have an issue with that, because they get afraid and scared, and they do not trust themselves to speak up, for example, and bring in great ideas. And that's, of course, a topic we should address to improve our whole design development and yeah, so on.
I think that leads us neatly to Alicia's question, and maybe Julie and Miriam would like to answer this, as why do we think that there are these different stereotypes between men and women of each other's roles?
In fact, it's not so obvious because if we refer to the questionnaire, concerning stereotypes, as I said in my key takeaways, stereotypes, men and women have very similar stereotypes in the 3 countries, French, Germany, and Italy. And women senior executives are often seen like behaving like men in Europe. But we are now starting the same study in North America. And it appears that these stereotypes is not true in North America. And concerning the perception of an equality culture in companies, there's very little difference between men and women on employee engagement and work-life balance, whereas there is a marked difference between men and women regarding perception of why the glass ceiling remains and the feeling of discrimination.
That's interesting, because we might want to bring people in from the developing world. We once had a very interesting discussion in Cambridge amongst the PhD students there many years ago, and it turned out that there were 50% engineering students in South America who were women, and also about a quarter of engineering students in Egypt, and that there seems to be a much greater acceptance of women in engineering roles in countries that we would naively as Westerners think is maybe being or having less equality than we have in the West.
Yeah, once again, this study is not, unfortunately, I have very, very few references because it's based on a questionnaire, and we had on the 3 countries, only 3 countries in Europe, 2,400 respondents. That is quite huge, actually, but it's still based on perception. It's still based on what people perceive, what people think, and there's it's really empirical. But I presented the results in France, in Canada, in Singapore, in US, and I'm very, very happy to have the opportunity to present it here today, because for me it's something to be exchanged so as to enrich the discussion and to see how and in which direction we can go more.
Thank you very much, Julie. I think we should probably move on or move back to Sebastian's talk. Sebastian, are you back in business? Can you talk now? No, we can still not hear you. Dario, any suggestions what might be wrong with Sebastian's mic?
I think it's probably his microphone. Sebastian, can you please go to the virtual help desk? There's our team who can maybe help you. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Okay, sorry, Sebastian. I think we can read your questions. So if you can't speak to us, maybe you'll just have to answer us in writing, because it would be very interesting to discuss whether some of these different perceptions and stereotypes also apply across the disciplinary boundaries between design engineers and simulation engineers. But maybe while Sebastian figures out how to speak, we can move on to questions about the other talks. We had a question from David about both Mattia and Alexander, which I think in practice means Boris in this case, who says, what happens to creativity in projects when you introduce the work you presented? Are you supporting and facilitating creativity and innovation at the risk of inhibiting
That's a
it?
very
Have you got thoughts on that,
actually.
Boris?
That's a really, really interesting question, David. And there's so many ways you could skin this particular cat. To answer the question short, no, I would not expect this to inhibit creativity. As a matter of fact, the way that the work that Mattia and I have been that we've been carrying out, and how we look at how we can actually produce design ideas and visions for new designs and concepts, is actually trying to facilitate that creativity process and thinking ahead of what could become a new thing, a new trend, not in the next 2 years, but 5 years from now. And how can we design for something that will hit that before it even exists? So we're looking into the whole abductive reasoning as per not looking at trends and how they develop, but what is behind that trend and what does it mean in terms of a user change, a change of user behavior that then becomes a new market and a new need. So it really tries to facilitate that creativity process. What comes on top of it is actually that reasoning backwards then. So what are the steps that we need to carry out eventually to get there, but have attainable milestones as we go along that can become individual design projects. The other way you can answer the question is, I would argue, and this is going to be contentious, I know that already, that creativity is not the deciding factor for innovation anymore. And here's my reason why, and David might dispute that. If you look at, particularly the innovation process within large organizations where you have, crowd sourcing of ideas, or people have suggestion boxes, whatever, there's so many different ways that you can facilitate ideation throughout a company or take ideas through crowdsourcing from the outside as well. And so you have a huge sorry, is that me?
No, okay. I think we lost Dario.
My point is creating a lot of really good ideas. There are ways to do that. Selecting them correctly and finding the really good ones. That's actually becoming more of an issue nowadays. And I can't really speak for Alex. I can't really speak for Alexander. Thank you very much. But I reckon that his approach is actually meant for something which is a bit later down the track. So when you're actually running a design project, can you prioritize different tasks because of the efforts that are involved with it?
Right. I haven't changed any settings. It seems to work here, and it seemed to work in the help desk. So I'll just rejoin the session and hope that.
Okay, maybe now. But we can hear you now. But I was going.
That's fine.
Pretty much the same question to Miriam at this point, whether the reference processes are something that actually facilitate or inhibit the creativity in an organization.
That way, if you have a very, very detailed reference process with a lot of if and else, which describes very detailed each possibility of executing a design project, then it restricts the creativity. But if you have a reference process that gives enough space and gives possibilities and shows decisions that can be made during the adaptation of the reference process for a specific project, then I think it can also push creativity, especially if there are some white spots which are lighted out and where the project leaders or project participants are required to create their own way of solving a problem. But that's always a trade-off of supporting, but not supporting too much to give space to find new, better ways to do something. And that's something where companies are currently struggling with, because they aim always to have very, very detailed reference processes, which describe very in detail what to do and what not to do. And then there's only one decision maker who is responsible for a gate, and that of course restricts the creativity of the designers.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I think that's a very good answer. Sebastian, do you think you succeeded now?
All the spots do I do here?
Congratulations, we can hear you now.
Without talking about technical issues, maybe to the question of David before, if I may, Claudia. It was, on the one hand, whether it's often the case that these two departments are separated, and I do not have numbers on how many companies separate these two disciplines, but what I can say is that the vast majority of the persons we talk to separate these, at least in not necessarily by departments, but always by teams. Aware that there are multiple disciplinary teams from the beginning. Most of the time, it's a matrix organization or just two separate departments. And then about designers conducting their own simulations. I was getting that question pretty often, whether my approach is any valid anymore in about 10 years, when all the simulations are done in CAD and you don't have to have a simulation expert anyways, so that this problem solves itself. But I would say that this will not be the case, because a lot of the more specified simulations like computational fluid dynamics or electronic simulations will still be have to be done by experts. Think about crash or something like that, which is not easily done by a designer themselves. And actually, I've been told by many companies that CAD integrated FEM systems are regarded as very inefficient, because the people should be able to do design, and they should most of the time be able to drive the design process, because this is most of the time done by the design department instead of the simulation department. So they already have two major tasks, and then also to educate them on simulation methods would just overwhelm people and lead to inefficient collaboration. So this in a nutshell. We can discuss it further if you want to together then.
Can you actually characterize the designers and simulation engineers? What is it that makes them so different?
To prejudices again, as like in Julie's talk, but what I can at least say from talking to many people and from experience is that designers most of the time have a more of a bigger picture view on the whole project, especially because they have direct contact to customers, while most of the simulation experts work within the company and just focus on solving the problem instead of seeing the whole project. And often they are not even giving the possibility to. And simulation engineers tend to be more introverted and more than designers. That's at least the prejudice I developed by talking to people. So there's a difference in the characters. That's true. It's not always the case, but the trend towards that.
So are they essentially mathematicians rather than engineers, or are they also engineers?
I think many people will be offended if you don't say that they're engineers. So I think simulation experts still are engineers, because what simulations are basically doing is mechanics rather than math. But still, you're right in saying that there is much more of formula crunching and much more of math in their work and also in their thinking instead of geometries. That's true.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome, Freddie. I hope you haven't been lurking in the background and we didn't see you all throughout the session.
Not at all. I'm afraid that a complete misunderstanding of time zones. That's I guess one of the hangovers of a remote conference rather than all being in the same place. But yes, no, I'm apologies for not being here earlier.
Well, great to have you now for the last 3 minutes of our session. So maybe I can ask you the question that was posed to you and to the third talk, which is how does what you've done affect creativity
I don't feel
in design
from
teams?
the application of my method, I don't feel that it hinders creativity. I feel that if it just helps. Certainly, it helps the design teams that I've used this with. It has helped them sort of recall past projects and just sort of helps them almost take that first step sort of more quickly of, oh, I remember a separate project where something similar or little elements that or little problems that they had to overcome. It just kind of speeds up that bit so that they can use more of their time towards the next step of the creativity of applying those lessons to future projects or the current project that they're dealing with.
Thank you very much. We've nearly come to the end of the session. So thank you for an interesting discussion here. And I think there are two things that I take out of all of your talks. I think one is that processes enable and can give people freedom to explore and can give people freedoms by giving them structure. And I think the other thing is that we need to embrace the diversity of the different people we've got in processes and really make sure that they're all being deployed to the best of their ability. I think with that, I would like to thank you all very much, and maybe we'll see each other and can pick up the conversations in our after conference talks.
Thank you, Claudia.
I think we've now got quarter of
Thanks,
an hour
Claudia,
break
for
before
managing
we've got
this.
the keynote.
Good night, Boris.
Goodbye. Yeah.
Sander actually asked the question. Should I quickly answer or should I do it
Bye.
separately with you? I was just going to say, sorry, I don't
Yes,
want to
of
be
course.
misunderstood. No, I completely still believe creativity is paramount in creating ideas and in selecting the right problems. Completely agree with that. No, Sander, please do not misunderstand. But once you have the ideas out and a selection of them, in the innovation bit that we're talking about specifically, it becomes harder and harder to select the ones to actually go for. And it's that rationalization process of what's our vision and how do we actually break that down into something we want to do or not do and what's the mix and what's the portfolio we're going to have. Those decision-making processes are becoming more and more difficult, and that's what we see companies struggling with more and more. That's what I wanted to say. So that's where they actually invest a lot of a resource at the moment, also for artificial intelligence. Creating ideas is still important, but it sort of has moved out of the focus point. That's what I was going to say. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Boris. I think in a physical conference, we would now say that this is a perfect question to discuss over the coffee break. So maybe we can send each other email messages over the coffee break. So
See you later.
in that spirit, see you later.